Hello everybody, it is time to review chapter 4, which is on food preparation. And what we're going to talk about throughout this chapter is some of the basic kitchen equipment that we'll use in lab and may be essential for you in your own personal kitchen. We're also going to familiarize ourselves with the temperatures involved in food preparation and then identify the 3 types of heat transfer. So there's a couple of distinctions right off the bat that we need to really keep in mind, and we'll practice this in lab, is there are 2 ways that we measure ingredients. The dry measuring is done in those measuring cups that you see up here. These are for dry things only. They are not for any liquid ingredients that you might have. The most common groupings of these is what you see here, starting from 1 cup, half cup, 1/4 a cup, 1/3 cup, etc. Very rarely have I seen 1/8 of a cup. Other things that you can use, and this can be for liquid and dry, but primarily dry, are the measuring spoons. And these go from 1 tablespoon to 1 teaspoon to half to 1/4. Be very careful when you purchase these kinds of things at novelty shops. I kind of prefer metal, because they tend to hold their shape a little bit better. Some of your plastic ones or your ones that are kind of kooky designs tend to be a little bit less accurate. And if you're baking, that is a big problem. Now, let's say we're measuring liquid things. Then you use these liquid measuring cups. And these are typically in 1 cup or 2 cup increments. I really love these because you can measure looking over the top. These you would have to put it on the counter and look from the side, just like in chemistry class. But a pour spout is really, really nice, and they have it broken up into milliliters and in cup sizes. Mixing bowls, it's always important to have a nice good set of mixing bowls. They come in metal, glass, or ceramic. That preference is really up to you, although as we go through some of the labs, there will be times when we prefer one type over another. It's good to have more than one, because if you're ever making something, you don't want to have to wash that bowl to use it, again. So having multiple sizes is really handy. 2 mixers that we will have in most of the labs is a stand-up mixer and a hand mixer. The picture you see on the left is, of course, the stand mixer. It's more powerful than the hand mixer. They are more expensive as well, and sometimes they'll have attachments like you see with this KitchenAid one. Those are really handy if you're mixing a bunch of things and you want both hands to be free. The hand mixer is really nice and convenient and easy to clean. I prefer those a little bit more, plus it takes up less space in your kitchen. They also come with multiple attachments, but keep in mind they're not as powerful. So if you have a really thick batter, sometimes it can make it more difficult. Other equipment that you might like to have, and I'm not going to go through all these because there's going to be a little activity in class where you have to identify them, but these are some examples of things that you really want to have on hand in your kitchen. As far as cutlery goes, or knives, the best type of knives are those that have the blade that extends all the way to the handle or the tang. So it's good to have those. Those are the best kinds of knives to have. You want to make sure that when you are cleaning the knives that you do so very carefully, because the blades can easily be damaged by detergent or getting too hot or hitting other utensils. In the lab, as far as safety, don't ever put a knife in the water that you're washing with until you're ready to actually wash it, because if you throw it in there with all the other stuff, somebody could easily cut themselves. A thermometer is also very important to have. At least one meat thermometer or thermometer that can measure. We talked about how important it was to keep foods cooked to the appropriate temperature, so you should have something like that. I really like these with the long handle here, because if you're only going to have one, it'll fit in almost any food. Something like this is a little bit smaller and may not get deep enough that you're looking for. Other cooking equipment, something to keep in mind, the difference between pots and pans. Pots have straight sides. See this one here, this Dutch oven? This has straight sides and 2 handles. That makes it a pot. These are considered pans right here because they have 1 handle, and this they usually are a little bit more shallow. Now, this one's kind of a confusing one, so don't get too confused. It could be considered a pot, but it's technically too shallow. A double boiler, and we'll use this in lab, has a bottom open pan and a top pan, and it's used typically to melt something where you don't want the direct heat hitting the bottom of the food, so you usually put water down here and then the food up here to melt it or just slowly heat it up. Frying pans have slopes. See how they're sloped up on the side, and they're usually shallow. You want to make sure that you have a couple of different sizes because you want the food to fit in there nicely so it can be stirred and turned without spilling over to the side. Cast iron pans are really popular in Kentucky because a lot of our staple foods are made in cast iron. They cook very well, but they're very, very heavy, and they take really special treatment to clean. You cannot put these in detergent and wash them regularly. You mostly just cook them and then clean them off with hot water. You don't want to warp these pans. You can warp them by cooking with them and then running cold water or a cold liquid over them. That quick change from hot to cold temperatures will cause the bottom of your pan to have a ripple or a warping look. Let's talk about some different dishes that we'll have throughout the semester. Not every group will have these in their kitchen and we'll use them, but if you have a draw the lucky draw and make the gingerbread soufflés, you'll make a soufflé. This is a soufflé dish. It's usually very small as far as the circumference, but it's deep so that the soufflé gets cooked. Pop-over pans, oh, my picture didn't turn out very well. The pop-over pan, if you'll see, it kind of looks like a muffin tin, or only it allows for more airflow around it, and it's narrower at the base, because what happens in a pop-over is the air causes the top to get really big, and the bottom will be very narrow. Cake pans, typically 9 inches by 11 inches, rectangular shaped. Tube pans, or sometimes if you've made cheesecake, you've made something like this where there's the tube in the middle. This is called a spring form pan here with the spring that pops open to let your cheesecake come out real nice and easily. Here's a bundt pan, which is actually named after the creator who made it with this design on the side and the hole in the tube in the middle so that the cake cooks and looks specifically like a bundt cake. Cookie sheets and jelly roll pans. So this is considered jelly roll. See how it has this little side up on here? That's considered a jelly roll pan, whereas a cookie sheet, if you can tell here, is flat all the way around. Now, can you use this jelly roll pan for a cookie sheet? Oh, sure you can. It doesn't matter. But you don't really want to use something like this for a jelly roll pan. So they are a little bit different as far as their purpose. And most of you have seen a pie pan. This is going to have your kind of bowed out edges here and then the lip on the outside so that you can make your beautiful pie crust. A quiche pan will look different. It doesn't have the lip, and most people like their quiche pan to have some sort of ridging to make the quiche sides look really nice and fancy too. So when you're measuring dry ingredients, you want to make sure that you get the right size. If something calls for 3/4 of a cup, you don't want to use a 1/2 cup and a 1/4 cup to get you to 3/4. You want to use the full measuring. Another example would be if it tells you to use a cup, you don't want to use 2 1/2 cups. You really want to use the fullest amount that you can. And same thing with the spoons. Now, you want to make sure that you read the directions, and we'll talk about this especially with baking. Sometimes you'll want to sift the dry ingredient like flour into that measuring cups, and sometimes you can just stir it in. Most of the things that we will measure, you'll scrape the tops, and we'll practice this in class. So if I were to dip my measuring cup into flour, I'm going to scrape the top to make sure it's level. I want to make sure that with special things like cornstarch or flour, that I don't go over with those things. And a lot of times with flour, especially if I'm baking, I'm going to be sifting. You do not pack flour down, which means you don't push it down as hard as you can into the measuring cup. You want it to be kind of airy and fluffy in there. You find that a little bit different with things like brown sugar. Most of the time, if the recipe calls for brown sugar, you're packing it in as hard as you can into that measuring cup to get a nice compact measurement. With fats and oils, now these are liquids, so they're going to go in your liquid measuring cups, but they can also go in your small tablespoons and teaspoons. If you're doing something like lard or Crisco, you scrape the top as well there, but you also make sure when you're putting it into the measuring cup that you scrape and get to all the surface area at the bottom. You don't want big pockets of air stuck in there. You want to make sure, and I mentioned this before, if you're using the liquid measuring cups and you don't have one that's slanted to where you can look over the top, that you put the measuring cup on the counter and you get to eye level, just like you would in chemistry class, to make sure that that 1 cup is exactly at the 1 cup. Now, as far as safety, and we'll go over this again throughout the lectures in the labs, if there is a spill on the floor in the kitchen, it needs to be cleaned up immediately. It is very easy to fall on that surface and hurt yourself or spill something else. If you spill on the counter, you should clean it up. These counters are sometimes not level, and the spills will transfer and you can have cross-contamination. If you have a mat or a rug in your kitchen, it must be washable. It should not be something that's going to soak up any sort of spills and create bacteria and mold that can grow in there. Your electrical appliances should be unplugged before you wash them at all times, and you should wash them periodically. You should not leave them dirty and nasty, and you should make sure that they're always off before you put the food in there and plug it in. Hair restraints in lab, you will wear a hairnet. No ifs, ands, or buts. It will happen. Learn to love it. Knives. Make sure if you're transferring knives from one person to the other that you hold the knife blade when you hand to others. Always hold the knife. If it's laid on the counter, make sure that it is within reach, and if you grab it, you grab the blade, but it's not close enough to the edge to where it can fall off. Hot pads are there for a reason. Do not burn yourself by touching something in the oven. Be very careful. They need to be flexible so that you can grip pans, and they need to be in a large enough location so that when you pick up something, you don't have your hand that's bigger than the hot pad. Handles on pans need to be placed so that they are convenient to grasp, but they're not hanging over the edge of the range or over other burners. That's particularly important if you have children running around that can grab the pan easily off the stove. Now let's talk a little bit about these temperatures that I mentioned. And we'll go over these more in class. When water is transformed to ice, it gives off a little bit of heat, and that's called the heat of solidification. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but that changes if you add sugar or if you add salt, which we'll talk about when we make ice cream. The freezing point drops 3.35 degrees Fahrenheit for each gram of sugar you add, and there's a greater drop in the freezing point if you add salt. So that will make a difference in how quickly things freeze. Other things, lukewarm is about 100 degrees. So if something says add lukewarm milk, that's about the temperature you need. Scalding is when you get large bubbles on the sides, but the top surface of the fluid or the water is not bubbling too much. Simmering is when you get those bubbles that come up to the top, but they don't splatter, they don't break the surface. And then the next level up from that is boiling. When the bubbles are very large, they come to the surface and they pop and boil open. That creates a vapor, which then gets up into the air, depending on where you live, because barometric pressure will make a difference. Atmospheric pressure will make a difference. Boiling occurs at 212 degrees, and from when you convert boiling water to steam is considered to be the heat of vaporization. But again, it depends on the atmospheric pressure. Frying, so be careful because fat should not be boiling. Deep fat frying is usually around 375 degrees Fahrenheit. It takes a higher temperature to get fat to the consistency you need to cook foods. But be careful because anytime you add sugar or water, the fat will splatter. Different thermometers that you'll find in the lab. This one way over here is a candy thermometer. Not something that you would necessarily need in your own personal kitchens unless you make a lot of candy. Other ones, like this one here, might be something that you would have for meat. And then there are some, like appliance thermometers, that go in your kitchen ovens and your refrigerators.